Hello and welcome to the April Telegraph Book Club event with our special guest this month, Alan Johnson. My name is Jake Kerridge. I'm a book reviewer and interviewer for the Telegraph. Before we kick off, one or two announcements. A reminder that if you want to make this video full screen, hover the cursor over it and click on the square that will appear in the bottom right-hand corner to make the screen expand. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions for Alan. We'll get through as many as we can. Submissions for questions are now closed, but you can contact Telegraph Extra if you have any technical difficulties. The email address is extra@telegraph.co.uk, and our colleagues will be on hand to help you. So over to a man who has achieved a great deal in many different fields as a trades unionist, MP, a cabinet minister, a memoirist. He was apparently a very good postman. And now he's establishing a considerable reputation as an author of crime fiction. He's published 3 thrillers in the last few years: The Late Train to Gypsy Hill, One of Our Ministers is Missing, and his new book, Death on the Thames. They've received high praise. Johnson's writing style is easy, relaxed, self-deprecating, impressive, says The Observer. Johnson writes wonderfully, says The Telegraph. And I like this review of your first novel from The Sun, More Layers Than a Phyllo Pastry. So more layers to unpeel now in your latest book, Death on the Thames. Welcome, Alan.
It's great to be with you, Jake.
Thanks. I want to ask you first, I've read you had 2 ambitions really from childhood or teenage years, nothing to do with politics. They were to be a musician and to be a writer. Is that true?
Yeah, you skirted over my rock music career. I made a record when I was 16 with a band called The Area, and I thought that was going to be my future. It's an awful record. You can get it on YouTube, but my strong suggestion is not to. It was awful. Made just in Denmark Street, Regent Sound in Denmark Street. So I know these streets very well. But I had all my gear nicked. I was in another band called The In-Betweens. And when I was 18, all our gear got nicked, including my Hofner very thin guitar, which was very precious to me. And I needed to earn some money, so I thought I'd become a postman temporarily and go back to music after that. But life took a different turn. I'm still hoping to be a rock star. I don't think it's too late.
Of course not.
You know.
And to be a writer, I got the impression you were a clever boy, but not very into school. But you liked books. You always loved books.
Yes, I think I wasn't bad at learning, but I wasn't very good at being taught. So virtually autodidactic in that sense. I left school when I was 15. But books, because our mother, for some reason, had no history of books in her family, came from Liverpool, family of 11. Mother died mother died at 38 after having 11 children. Died at 42, having had 11 children by the age of 38. My mum, as the oldest girl, had to take over kind of bringing up the family. So she didn't have time to read. But she had this thing, which for the early 50s wasn't a kind of ubiquitous feeling about books being just good for you. If you can introduce your kids to books, that will go a long way to educating them. So she dragged me and my sister, Linda, down to Ladbroke Grove Library, almost as, when we were old enough to turn a page. And there's a kind of children's bit down in the basement. There was then, I think there still is now. The library's still open, unlike many others. And books became a real passion. So I've always been an avid reader.
And who did you like to read when you were young?
Well, when I was a kid, it was the books that were presented as kind of prizes at school, which were things like Tom Sawyer, Coral Island by Ballantyne. They were, and then books from the library, you had to give them back, so they were never your books, but those books were mine because they were prizes. And then a book called Shane by Jack Schaefer came into the house, famously made a film with Alan Ladd. Terribly disappointed with that, because Shane in the book is tall and dark and rides a black horse. And in the film, in comes little Alan Ladd, who had to stand on a soapbox because he was so small, blonde, white horse. Anyway, I just read and reread that book. And then I'm fortunate to have a great English teacher at my secondary school who told me, saw I was a voracious reader. Have you ever read Bennett? Have you ever read Dickens? Have you ever read Trollope? And he really did help to educate me. And even though I left school a year after Mr. Carlin came into my life when I was 14, he gave all of us boys a list of 50 books we had to read. And I'd kind of read them all, thanks to Ladbroke Grove Library, by the time I was in my early 20s. So he continued his education afterwards. And also I got into crime fiction at that time. I always say the first crime novel I ever read was Bleak House.
Yes.
You know, when you're dealing with this snobbery around, no crime writer has ever won the Nobel Literature Prize and all that, and that kind of snobbery. I mean, what's Crime and Punishment if it's not a crime novel? Dostoevsky. Nobody says Dostoevsky is a crime novelist. So thanks to Mr. Carlin, I got into all that as well.
And we know, of course, you like Pepys's Diary, because that was your book on desert island discs.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating to be taken back into the 17th century. Yeah.
And now you've written, you're getting close to a shelf full of books, really, now. And we might talk about some of the others later, but you can look back at your younger self now and say, I've achieved the ambition to be a writer.
Well, I don't think till it got to fiction, really, because fiction is what I've always read. And the memoirs were great and they did very well, but I kind of knew the characters and I knew the plot.
Of course.
And after I'd done 4 of those, the last one being a music memoir in my life, about my love of music, I thought, I'm sick of writing about myself. Can I create that world that will bring readers into it for as long as it takes to read 80,000, 90,000 words? That to me was Mount Everest. If I could climb that mountain, then I could really call myself a writer. I didn't call myself a writer, despite the prizes and all that were great for the memoirs, until the fiction came along. And whether, good, bad, or indifferent, it's a real achievement to get a book of fiction. Many great writers have fallen on,
of course, yes,
on fiction. They were good at writing other stuff, but couldn't do fiction. So I feel satisfied with it, but it's only when the novels came out from 2021, I kind of felt as if I could call myself a writer.
Right. So you saw that as a challenge, and was it a challenge? Was it very different from writing?
Very different, yes, very different, because of that world of imagination that you've created, and the need to develop characters. Place is always very important, and all the books I've ever read, the place has been as important as the characters almost. So I tried to do that with Gypsy Hill, and with it was the second one actually that the reviewer said it was like a phyllo pastry, mainly because it was set in Crete, with a Greek detective called Diamantopoulou. So I would say it's harder, to invent things rather than remember things. It's an act of, it's an act of imagination rather than an act of memory. And sure, you have to string a sentence together for the memoirs, but I think fiction is much more challenging, much more difficult, much more satisfying to complete.
Okay. Well, we might talk about some of your other books later, but let's talk about Death on the Thames. We'll start with, I think it will strike anybody who reads the first few pages. Chapter 1 concerns the murder set in 1999 of a television presenter in circumstances that will seem very familiar, strikingly similar to the murder of Jill Dando, the Crime Watch presenter. And there are some similarities between your character, Jenny Daniels, and Jill Dando, but also a lot of differences, I think we can safely say.
Yes.
But you obviously drew on the Dando case, so why did you want to do that?
I did, and Jenny Daniels, Jill Dando is the same initials and all that. I wanted to take Mangan back, my detective, who comes into it when she's sort of approaching her 50s with my first novel. I wanted to take her back in time to those days in the 90s when the Macpherson report came out, said the Met was institutionally racist and all that. Thinking that all the problems that have happened now, the terrible, terrible murder of Sarah Everard, for instance, and this guy who was in the police, not just in the police, but in the protection corps of the police, protecting people like me when I was Home Secretary, with a record as long as his arm for violence against women. I mean, I'm a huge admirer of the police. I was before I was Home Secretary, even more so afterwards. But to give a realistic picture of the Met, you can't ignore, it's got to be warts and all. You can't ignore the warts. And I wanted to take Mangan, who's already faced some of those problems contemporaneously, back 20 years. So I thought, well, it's got to start in 1999 because 20 years would be 2019. I didn't want to get into the COVID period.
Yes.
I think every
Pre-COVID,
writer is trying to avoid
yeah.
COVID period. So 20 years back is 1999. You look, oh, what happened in 1999? Well, Jill Dando kind of leaps out at you. And because it's a subplot. I mean, as you know, because you've read it, Jake, it's not the main story, but it's an interesting subplot, and it allows me, while I'm dealing with this rapist, this person who's assaulting women all over the Hampton Court area of London, to kind of bring in that element, to transfer what happened to Jill Dando from Fulham to Hampton Court area, East Molesey. And so that struck me as being a legitimate way to get the reader to grasp what period we're talking about, which I think is helpful. The other thing I wanted to do was use this place. So we were talking about the importance of place. There's this island on the Thames called Tags Island, and I wanted the book to be called Tags Island. My publisher, as always, thought I was daft. You know, that could be a kind of guidebook to London or something. So they changed it to Death on the Thames. I'm glad they did. But Tags Island was just a fascinating place and a very atmospheric place. I mean, and it exists, as I've described it in the book, with these 62 houseboats that are all more house than boat. These are two-story things all around this lagoon on the inner part of Tags Island and the outer part of Tags Island. And that struck me as a great place for an atmospheric mystery novel.
Yes, very atmospheric. Also quite a placid area, so that's the contrast between the lovely setting and the nastiness of the crimes.
The trouble is I don't know anyone who lives on Tags Island. My publicist for the book, the fabulous Caitlin, told me once I'd written the book and she'd seen it, she hadn't seen it till I'd written it, that she's got a friend who lived on Tags Island. Unfortunately, I'd read that, you're too late. And I'd love to talk to somebody because it strikes me that the people who live on houseboats are all a little bit eccentric. I'm not saying there's any criminal fraternity there, but lots of artists, people who, by and large, have kind of separated themselves a bit from the mainstream. And that's a good, fertile territory for criminals.
And this book has a dual timeline. So the first half, more or less, is set in 1999, second half in 2019, as you said. And the first bit, we get to find out something about the early career of Louise Mangan, who is featured in all three of your thrillers. So can you remember when you came up with the character originally? And did she pop into your head, or was it a long process?
It was really thinking, if I'm going to take on the challenge of fiction, I wanted it to be a mystery story. I had this idea for the first book that was sparked by what happened to Litvinenko when I was in cabinet. I wasn't anywhere near it. I was education secretary, but there were cabinet debates about how the outrageous way that Putin sent his people in to murder one of his ex-agents in a London cafe by serving them tea laced with polonium-2010. So I knew what the kind of plot was going to be. My detective, just to add to the challenge of doing fiction, can I make my character a woman? Can I write from the other gender? And also, really, there's so many male characters around.
Very true.
And that wouldn't have allowed me to bring in this strand of misogyny, which, I didn't witness too much as Home Secretary, but I wouldn't. It's the poor women who were working as detectives, some of whom did tell me some of their stories, which were pretty horrendous. So that's really why I did it, whether I'd done it successfully or not. I mean, don't talk to my wife. She thinks I'm useless at looking at things from a woman's perspective, but it makes it more interesting for a writer, and I hope for a reader as well.
Does she ever give you tips then?
All the time, yeah. Well, she's the first one to read it. So, because Late Train Gypsy Hill was a lot about someone putting on makeup on the train, this phenomenon that I've noticed, which never happened when I was a kid. I was on the tube all the time. I never saw women putting on a full face of makeup on their way to work, the way that seemed to happen 20 years later. Must be more pressures of life. But of course I had to get Carolyn, my wife, to tell me every kind of how it all worked, what went on first and all that. So yeah, she's very
Yes.
useful
Yes.
style guru and advisor.
And that gave you the great beginning to Late Train to Gypsy Hill with the compact held up with the words "Help Me" on
Written in lipstick. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
terrific. So it's fun to see Louise as a young woman in the early part of this book when her marriage is still going. We know it will fail later. Her children are young, energetic, ambitious, as you say, challenging sexism and racism. It's 1999, as you said earlier. The Macpherson report came out around the time Jill Dando was killed, so it's obviously fertile time to write about. Do you think, in terms of racism and sexism, obviously two different areas, but have things improved at the rate you'd hope since 1999?
If you'd have asked me that question before the Sarah Everard case, I'd have said yes.
Right.
But, you know, there's a bit in the book actually about this, the ticking boxes, you know, have you done this? Have you done that? And these men who have come into the police with this mindset and with these attitudes soon know how to answer the right questions and tick the right boxes. Doesn't mean to say you've solved the problem at all. So I guess I was looking at the boxes being ticked. I was looking at the first ever woman, as happens in my book fictionally, to become the to head the Met. So it should have been going in the right direction. But, you know, I don't want to overdo this, but I can't tell you how shocked I was about Sarah Everard. It just really made me depressed. Now, if that did that to me, imagine what it did to really good police officers who risked their lives day in and day out to see that guy manage to get into that position and only get her into that car by showing his warrant card. You know, I mean, it's chilling, absolutely chilling. So obviously there is much more work to be done to weed out these characters.
And Louise, in the present day or 2019 storyline, she was once an assistant commissioner of the Met. She's basically volunteered to be demoted to chief superintendent because she wants to solve crimes and not push paper. But it's a very demanding job, being a police officer, obviously. And you know a few, and the novel is dedicated to a police officer.
To my what would have been my father. He died before I met my wife. He was detective chief superintendent in the Greater Manchester Police. Some of this is set in Greater Manchester, so I dedicate the book to him. But the reason why I had to demote Louise Mangan is because I shouldn't have promoted her in the first place. Right. So in the first book, I thought I was sort of doing her a favour that she'd done such a brilliant job on the Late Train to Gypsy Hill. She got promoted. Where can I promote her to? What are the kind of, assistant commissioner? That'd be good, a woman being assistant commissioner. The trouble is, of course, they have nothing to do with solving crimes. They're more administrators. So when it came to the second book, I had to think, how can I get her involved, you know, at the coalface again? That's why this idea came up that a minister goes missing in Crete and she as a senior officer is sent as the liaison officer. Having done that, I then have to, in book 3, what am I going to do with her now? So she kind of demoted herself because she didn't like being a bureaucrat.
And it's a difficult job being a copper, as you know, being married to the daughter of a copper. I'm sure she's told you stories. And Louise has a hard time maintaining relationships, doesn't she? Her marriage broke down. She calls it gradual deterioration. It was nothing, big crisis. And now she's in a relationship with the nice Greek policeman she met in Crete. But again, it's hard to maintain a relationship.
And it's not going very well because he's on the other side of the world. No, I mean, it's not the only job that does this to you, but, you know, she was married to another police officer, Tom Mangan. And so they're both very busy. He's a desk sergeant. She's gradually going up the detective route. They never see each other, you know, gradually, like most marriages do. It's not some big kind of dramatic EastEnders plot that finishes the marriage. It's just a gradual moving apart. And that's what happens. That's what happens to her. And the job is a big part of it. I mean, the job is 24/7. You can't deny that once you get to that position in the police, well, it probably is at any position, but certainly when you get to that position as a detective chief inspector, as she was, and then a detective chief superintendent, relationships suffer. And she's quite lonely. She knows that retirement's coming up, because with the police, as soon as you get to 50, you're thinking about retirement if you've done a certain number of years. And, you know, she wants to stay in the police and wanted to be back on detective work because she can't stand the thought of having nothing to do, you know, and with no, her daughter's grown up and her just falling around in that big flat in Brixton.
And there's a possibility we might see Louise on screen.
Well, I've sold the screen rights. Yeah. I mean, I know lots of people sell the screen rights. It never appears on the screen. But I get my money for selling the screen rights. If it goes to film, there's obviously a role for me there as well. But I sold them to the actress Michelle Collins, we were just talking about EastEnders. Michelle, of course, is doing a lot in EastEnders. I forgot her name in EastEnders. Something Bill, isn't it?
Cindy.
Cindy. So she's obviously busy being Cindy Beale in EastEnders at the moment. Returned to the cast last year. She read the first book, Late Train Gypsy Hill, told me how much she liked it. I met her in a television studio somewhere. And I said, well, I'd love you to play Louise Mangan. She has a production company called It Works, and she's done a number of productions. And one thing led to another, and she just, the other week, we signed a deal for her to have the screen rights. And it's quite useful. The reason why I'm quite optimistic that it will reach the screen is because Michelle knows the world of television back to front. She wasn't only in EastEnders for all those years. She was a star of Coronation Street for 3 or 4 years, and has done lots of other big major TV projects. So there's no one in television she doesn't know. And, you know, I think she's got sufficient. I've not sold the screen rights to some anonymous person who's got no interest in television and no interest in my books. I've sold it to someone who is quite the opposite.
This is the sort of person you want backing you in this in that business. Yeah. And I was going to ask, there's a lot going on in this book, a lot of crime for Louise to investigate. There's a great line, somebody says, it's only on TV that detectives get to investigate one crime at a time. So we have murder of a TV presenter, as we've said, random sexual assaults on women, abduction of a teenage girl. We've got Serb drug dealers organising a smuggling ring, bank robberies, taking place over 2 time frames. It's a lot for a writer to organise and get together. Are you somebody who plans it all out beforehand, or you just start and see where it goes? It's a lot to tie together, and the readers, they want to see how these plots will all tie up. The
big question, I'd love to get your take on this, Jay, because you're an expert on these books. For me, it was a kind of new world. And I read a lot of Agatha Christie when I was young, Marjorie Allingham, all those great, Ngaio Marsh, those great, the kind of 1930s golden age of the crime. And they were all women. Women were really good at murder, although there were very few women detectives. Miss Marple really is the only one, and she's not with the police. I started to listen to people like Anne Cleeves and Val McDermid. You know, I went to these literary festivals and mystery festivals and listened to them, and none of them plot. I haven't met anyone yet. You know, just away from women writers, Ian Rankin. You know, they virtually just start and see where it takes them. Now, I can't do that. I'm no Anne Cleeves and I'm no Val McDermid, as you probably noticed. I have to have a kind of thread that runs through it, but I understand why they don't plot intricately, because it takes some of the energy out of the book, and it stops your ability to go to different places. I'm sure Dickens sometimes must have regretted doing, David Copperfield in installments, because he couldn't go back and change anything. No. Whereas in a mystery novel, if you've not, done everything like painting by numbers, you can change things around. You have different ideas. You can move in a different direction. And And that's happened with all three of my books. I know where it's going to start, kind of know where it's going to end, but in the middle, all kinds of things can happen. And I can't think of any other way to do it. But no doubt there are really successful writers who plan it out to the nth degree.
But you can, unlike Dickens, you can always go back and make things fit together.
Absolutely. I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm also nothing like Dickens, by the way. Let's stop the comparisons.
No, although you do write very well about London. And I just mentioning bank robberies. Just tell us a bit about Basil Bennett, because I think he's a character that readers will love.
Well, he came into my mind because of the robbery that took place in London, which was outrageous and was in Hatton Gardens, if you remember. And they still don't know who did it, but they know that they were getting on a bit. I mean, there's been a film about them, but there's a couple of characters missing. And Basil, I thought of as one of the characters that were missing. Never gets involved in violence, won't have anything to do with violence. Admires the police in many ways. His skill is cracking safes and digging tunnels. And there are a few, so the Basil Bennett one where he's, well, you can't give the plot away here, but the Basil Bennett one where he tunnels his way into the money storage facility, that actually happened. It didn't happen in this country, it happened in Mexico, but it happened. So I nicked that as a kind of
right,
plot line.
it was a real...
Yeah, as a real kind of, because Basil was the perfect person to do it. And, you know, you're always putting in bits of real characters. When I was a postman, I worked with this guy called Ron Riches, who thought he had a wonderful vocabulary, poor Ron. But the words were always wrong. No one ever told him. He was a big guy, so you kind of didn't want to argue with him. And he was one who would say, when the supervisor, I was a union rep, when the supervisors came round and told him to do something, he would come complaining to me. Alan, he would say, this is catamount to mutiny. And I thought, no, the word is tantamount, not catamount. But I didn't want to tell Ron. But I stood that up and used it in
immortalised
it. Because Basil is always getting his words wrong. And that's a kind of gentle way to kind of make fun of a character who's not, you know, I mean, he's a smart cookie, is Basil. But he's very smart at things other than the English language. He just gets a bit overconfident.
It makes him more sympathetic, you know.
Yeah, I think so.
Likeable. We're going to ask you a couple of brief questions about your career, as well as your political career, as well as your books. And of course, people will remember you're Education Secretary and Health Secretary and Home Secretary, and then Shadow Chancellor after the 2010 election. But I mean, you never intended to be an MP, did you? It happened very precipitately.
Yes, it's a story I tell in the third volume of my memoirs, Long and Winding Road. Yeah, I didn't want to be an MP at all. I was General Secretary of the Union. I mean, that was to me, that was the pinnacle. Why would I want to give up a decent salary to go to the back benches? You know, a position of power that I'd worked my way up to in the union, position of influence. But a man called Mr. Blair, Tony Blair, I was on the NEC of the Labour Party, and he persuaded me that I should stand. Tony had this thing about people getting into Parliament who hadn't spent their whole lives trying to get into Parliament. He wanted, in the approach to the 97 election, to have people there who were...
It's a good idea.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's not a bad idea, given that there were so many on that treadmill. You know, they'd done PPE at Oxford or Cambridge, and then they came in as a special advisor, and then a seat was found for them, and no real experience of life. So in the end, my predecessor in Hull, Weston, Hessel, stepped down to spend more time with his peerage, and I was parachuted in at the last possible minute in 97. And I'm very pleased I did as well, because I think, you know, if I'd have got to my dotage, which I'm close to now, thinking if only I'd have made that change, you know, in my mid-40s. So it was a wonderful opportunity.
And so much time and material to cover, but perhaps you could just say if there's one achievement in your cabinet career you're very proud of, and perhaps something you regret that happened or you weren't able to do.
The achievement wasn't anything to do with a cabinet minister. although there were achievements there, it was something I did as a constituency MP. You are still a constituency MP.
Okay, yeah.
And in my constituency, Hull, it was the biggest distant water fishing port in the world until the Cod Wars in the early 70s. Fishing industry collapsed, all these men thrown out of work. Did the most dangerous job in the world. Mortality rate 17 times higher than coal mining. And were promised retraining, promised compensation, and they got nothing. 22 years later, when the incoming Labour government, I had to persuade them that although this was a historic case from the 70s, they should do justice to these men. We achieved trawlerman's compensation. To me, that was a huge, not just me, it was the guys themselves. And it was only the men who went to sea, but the women were and are formidable because, they had to bring their families up. The men went to sea for 3 weeks, came back for 3 days, went to sea for 3 weeks. That was my greatest achievement. The regret is that we didn't get rid of GCSEs because we lifted the education leaving age, which actually the coalition government in the war, Butler as education secretary under Churchill, had said that it would go to 18.
Right.
He envisaged it being at the back end of the 50s. It never had. So we lifted the education leaving age from 16 to 18, which meant GCSEs, which was virtually a school leaving certificate. You could do more things in that space. Mm-hmm. And you could also broaden the choice that kids have at A-level, where they're squeezed down to just 3 choices. And we had a report, the Tomlinson report, that said we ought to do it, but we didn't do it. And I think that's a regret, something we're still suffering from now.
Mm-hmm. And your novels they're not stridently political, but you sometimes see tiny clues. There's a reference here to problems caused by stringent cuts in police numbers in 2011. And not every author would have put the date in, but people will know, that's the year after you stopped being Home Secretary.
That's right.
But they're not hugely political, but little hints.
No, I don't. Wherever you stand on the political spectrum, the idea that you can cut police numbers by a fifth, and there'd be no ramifications. And that's what my successor as Home Secretary was Theresa May. She offered up those cuts in the age of austerity, which I found remarkable. Boris Johnson came along and reversed the policy. But the problem is, as I've alluded to in Death on the Thames, they've lost veterans and they're recruiting novices. They've lost all that fund of knowledge, and that experience has gone. And of course it had a huge effect. So crime at its lowest level for 30 years in 2010 is now back at its highest level for yonks. And no one can suggest, or is trying to suggest, that cut in police numbers wasn't a huge mistake.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, after the hurly-burly of politics, and especially those years as a cabinet minister, do you miss the buzz, when you're sitting at your desk alone with your laptop or whatever you use?
Actually.
Pen, yeah.
And write, yeah, and then put it onto the... Do I miss it, Jake? I can't tell you how much I don't miss it. It's, this is a world that I've got control of. This is a world where I don't need special advisors or civil servants, or, you can do it. I don't mind a solitary existence, that's fine. I love the control that you never had in the trade union movement. You certainly never had it in politics. You didn't know what was going to happen next. The ability to just, move these characters around and do what I like with them is hugely, hugely satisfying, and something I didn't expect to come, so late in my life. So, so no, I don't miss it at all. I occasionally get the whiff of gun smoke, when there's election coming and all that. But yeah, I can go and knock on some doors. Maybe that'll get rid of that. But no, I don't want to be back in politics again.
You could also sell the books door to door at the same time.
That's a good idea, actually, Jake. Yeah, thanks.
And if we go with the polls and assume Keir Starmer will have a majority, and if he called you in to advise him, what would you? Is there one thing you want, say, do this that you think maybe he's not going to do, or that you'd like to see him make?
Well, I hope he is going to do it. It's early intervention. So as part of what we were doing, and I had responsibility when I was at education, Sure Start Children's Centres. You know, this thing about children escaping the backgrounds they were born into. We call it social mobility now. It's been called various things. But these changes of, you know, bright kid from poor background starting to be disadvantaged against less bright kid from more prosperous background, they don't start when the kid's 18 or 16 or 10 or 8 or 5 or 4. They start when they're in their first 18 months, 2 years of their lives. These are crucial times. And this early intervention disappeared with most of the Sure Start Children's Centres. And I think we ought to not try and recreate what we were doing back in 2010, but Starmer's saying that he'll put nursery education into the school system, which has been tried before, didn't work terribly well. But at least something to get a framework there so that children can start. You know, probably the most successful education system in the world is in Finland. And people often say, well, they don't start school till they're 7 in Finland. They speak 3 languages by the time they're 11, by the way, Swedish, Finnish, and English. But what you have to see there is that nursery education from a very young age, 18 months in Finland. And yes, they've got the best education system in the world. They've got one of the lowest crime rates in the world. They, you know, all those things follow, all the things that politicians would want to do with society. It all starts with early intervention. So I'd try and convince him of that. I'd probably be there about 2 minutes and he'd say, cheerio, Alan, thank you very much. Go and write your books, but I'd have a go.
And we might guess that you're passionate about this because you came from what might be called a disadvantaged background, and you.
Well, it's that my mother taking me to the library when we were very young. You know, that chance of kids getting a good start in life.
And you wrote this extraordinary book, This Boy, your first book, your first memoir, which won the Orwell Prize. It's got amazing reviews, probably the best reviewed political memoir ever, I think.
It's great, yeah. And the Ondaatje Prize, don't forget. I like
yes, the Ondaatje Prize.
Royal Society of Literature, yeah.
But most politicians write memoirs when they leave office, and it's not, you know, they don't normally write about their childhoods in great detail. It's mostly, you know, this is what happened, this is why it wasn't my fault. People, they really responded to that book. It wasn't like other politicians' memoirs. I think people have the sense there's something different about you. You're not like other politicians. You think that's...
Well, I don't like reading political memoirs. So when the opportunity, when publishers were coming to me for memoirs, my agent at the time, who was an American guy called Andrew Kidd, also the only American I know who's a Queen's Park Rangers season ticket holder. I'm a big QPR supporter. He said, write about your childhood. You haven't really given that, you know, much exposure. And the more I thought about it, you know, the opportunity to make my mother live again, these 2 incredible women who happen to be my mother, Lily, and my sister, Linda. In a sense, I'm telling their story because it is an amazing story. Not so much my story, but their story. And to try and recapture that, you know, drab post-war world that we grew up in North, and to try and rescue North Kensington. You know, everyone talks about Notting Hill now, as if we never called it Notting Hill. We called it Kensal Town or the town or North Kensington. Notting Hill has sort of invaded whole swathes of West London that were never called Notting Hill before. And then, you know, I never saw Hugh Grant or Julia Roberts around our way very much. It's where Grenfell Tower is. North Kensington is a very poor area. So all of that came together. And of course, it's not like a normal political memoir because it finishes when I was 18. And I thought that would be it, but it did so well. People wanted the next stage of the story. So, you know, 3 other memoirs followed.
It seems amazing that it wasn't your idea almost, because it's just such an extraordinary story. It's crying out to be told.
Well, I think that's what Andrew, from talking to Andrew, was my first agent when we were talking about, you know, how would we structure this and all that. He saw it as a remarkable story. I mean, not least of all, so, you know, I mentioned about my mother. Her mother died at 42. her mother, my mother's maternal grandmother, died at 42. My mother was convinced there was some curse of the female line. She would die when she was 42, and she did. And so, you know, that in itself is a kind of interesting story, not least because, you know, she shouldn't, with the heart condition she had, mitral stenosis, she shouldn't have been in those terrible damp conditions that were everywhere, you know, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Belfast, but they were very, very prevalent in North Kensington. It was known as a very poor area with terrible housing, that when they knocked it down, you know, virtually by the 60s, it marked, I think, the real start of post-war prosperity for many people in those areas.
And do you think it's an advantage, it's better overall, better for the country if we have people, you know, in the cabinet, as you were, who have had that sort of background, or a bit different from the background of the majority of cabinet?
Not really. I mean, I think, you know, sort of class-based politics is a dead-end street. You know, nobody had any, Jacob Rees-Mogg, if you want to pluck a name out here, he didn't have any control over his childhood. David Cameron didn't have any control over being sent to Eton. You know, when you're a kid, you don't have any control over these things. Things just happen to you. And if you were going to take that view, you know, you wouldn't be an admirer, as I am, of Clem Attlee, for instance, who went to public school, was a great Labour Prime Minister. And I mention him because his grandson is reading the audio book of Devil on the Thames.
Oh, right. Yeah.
An actor called Richard Attlee. He's not just Clem Attlee's grandson.
He's an actor.
He's Kenton in The Archers.
Oh,
if anyone listens to The Archers, and as I do, he plays Kenton. So I've got Attlee in as well. But so, you know, class-based politics is just, you know, I should be in the cabinet because I had a pretty tough childhood. Well, you should be in the cabinet if you can, you know, if you're a reasonably astute politician. That's where you should be at. And you can run a department and you can motivate civil servants. You should be in the cabinet if you're doing those things.
Thanks. And we talked earlier about the transition from writing those 4 memoirs and then onto fiction. And the first novel was Late Train to Gypsy Hill. And that was a lot of fun. It's a sort of Eric Ambler or Hitchcock thing of the very ordinary man suddenly plunged into this world of intrigue and crime.
Gary, yeah. And at the time I wrote it, of course, it was before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian is the hero and the Russians are the enemies. But that was really, you know, I met Putin when I was energy secretary in the government. He's been there that long. It was quite interesting to me, not just to base it on that poisoning of Litvinenko, but to give a kind of feel for how the Russian state has now become an organized criminal network without any compunction about going overseas to, I mean, this was before Salisbury, of course. I wrote the book before Salisbury happened. So that was that was interesting. But I had to have Gary there as the kind of innocent abroad, and all this is going on around him. But it was great. It was great fun to write, and that was the one idea I'd been chewing over for a long time. You know, I had to work at the ideas for the next 2, but that one has been there fermenting for a long time.
Yes, that's where we, you know, some of us found out for the first time that people are referring to London as Moscow by the Thames, because there's so many.
Yeah, well, that wasn't original, but that's absolutely. And there's been lots more exposure of how Russians owning property. I mean, Chelsea's in there as well with Abramovich. He actually appears in the book, not fictionalized. He actually appears in the book, but you know, actually, there's nothing I could write fictional that would reflect the horror and terror of what's happening with the Russian state at the moment.
Did it seem obvious to you that the book would almost become topical instantly, or just get more and more topical? Because it was a few months after it was published that the invasion.
I thought that Putin timed that well for my book. I don't know whether he had any link with my publisher, Wildfire. It was going that way anyway. It's a great book called Putin's People, which I read and credit in the book. I'm just trying to think of the author, but she did a wonderful job of exposing and explaining what's happening around the world with Putin's Russia.
Thanks very much, Alan. We've got some of our viewer/reader questions to ask you now. And the first one is from Lorna. You might have to think about this one. If you got the opportunity to continue a mystery or detective series by a famous author, which author/series would you want to take on, and why? It's hard, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't want to take on anyone else's series, but if I had the choice, if I could write as well as this person, it would be the Maigret series by Georges Simenon. Simenon strikes me as one of the greatest writers that we've ever seen. I mean, he was miffed himself never to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I mean, those Maigret books are just perfect worlds to fall into. And even the books he wrote that didn't include Maigret, and there were 70 odd of those.
Yeah.
The non-Maigret books are just superbly written.
Yeah.
So carry on the Maigret series, I think.
But yes, as you say, there are 70 of those. You don't really need to.
No.
There are plenty to be going on with. But yeah, I agree. He's one of my absolute favourite writers. And we've covered this in a way, but Graham asks, what made you turn to crime for work, and specifies, i.e. writing books, but writing crime fiction.
Well, the first book, Late Train Gypsy Hill, was dedicated to my English teacher, Mr. Carlin, who's still alive, 96, living down in Bath. He encouraged me to write these detective stories because I read a lot of detective stories. I had these characters, Inspector Andrews and Mr. Midnight, loosely based on The Saint by Leslie Charteris. And he would get me to submit these as my English essays. And he would encourage me to send them off. He got the Artists and Writers Yearbook, dog-eared version of the Artists and Writers Yearbook, which is still published now, even in this internet age. And I would send these off, get the inevitable rejection slips. Mr. Carlin would say, Alan, every great writer could paper their wall with rejection slips. He was so encouraging about those stories that I kind of thought it was the natural genre for me to go into fiction. I wish I had this idea for the great novel, but I don't think that by great novel you're excluding detective fiction. You know, that snobbery does unfortunately exist.
And you're still in touch with Mr. Carlin?
Yes. I invited him to the launch of Late Train Gypsy Hill. He was too frail to get down, but his daughter came and his grandchildren, which was great.
Do you know if he read it?
He said he read it, yeah. It's marked my homework, sort of thing, yeah. Should do better, he said.
And we talked a bit about Tags Island, the location, but a few readers, Alison, Philip, AT, said, why did you choose Hampton Court as the location?
Because my son lives in East Molesey, my eldest son. And I saw Tags Island. I walked across that little bridge. In the book, it's got Louise for the first time going over. You can't walk onto many of these islands in the Thames. There's a few of them. But this one, they built a little bridge onto it. And you walk over it, and there's a big laminated board, welcome to Tags Island. And a kind of a chart where all the boats are around the island. And then you walk around, and it's only just across a short bridge from the main, A305, whatever it is that thunders past up towards the M3. You'd think you were in isolation in the countryside, you know, it's so quiet. So, you know, one visit to Tags Island, and it had to be the place where I'd locate the person who, without giving any plot away, is quite important to the story.
And as you say, they're interesting characters who live on the houseboats.
Bit eccentric, I think. You know, without wanting to upset anyone who lives on a houseboat, you have to be a bit eccentric, don't you, to live on water?
Maybe, yes. What's the word they use for people who live to describe themselves?
Liverboards.
Liverboards, yeah.
Yeah.
And tied in with that, Matthew asks, do you spend a lot of time in the places where your books are based to help improve the description?
I've spent as much time as I can in Crete. Me and my wife love going to Crete. I know London very well, back to front, because I didn't just start off as a postman in London. I was also a union rep, always dealing with London. You know, our members were everywhere. Every little place had a sub-delivery office, and we were so I know London well. So in that sense, yes, I do, and I know East Molesey and that area well. I didn't know Tags Island well, and for reasons we were talking about earlier, I wish I'd had a chance to talk to someone who lived on Tags Island before I wrote the book. But I don't think they'd think it was too outrageously divorced from the truth. I think it's pretty much how they live. There's a story in there about people using colour gas and then taking the empty containers and using them as heaters. Well, I didn't make that up. It's something that the different agencies are worried about. So I try to make it as realistic as possible.
It's good to leave a little room for the imagination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Crete, presumably you knew Crete already before you set One of Our Ministers is Missing.
I'd driven through the White Mountains a lot, and I knew the place on the south coast of Crete where I based most of that. Because most people go to the north coast, but the south coast is very, very much quieter and much better for a crime thriller.
We've got a question from Jo, and says we're bound to get some sort of Paxman-esque hard questions. She says, "Do you ever think you wrote one too many memoirs?" So possibly she's didn't like the last one as much.
Right, yeah. Okay. Well, that was about music.
Yeah, that was your music.
Yeah, I just had to finish the story, and people complained about the third one because it was politics. You know, suddenly we were into me being a member of Parliament, and I'd avoided it for the first two. But that's because it was in chronological order. The last one, maybe she means Long and Winding Road. I hope you did. What was her name?
Jo.
Jo. I hope you mean the Long and Winding Road, because I think in my life, which was it's all about music. It's a track for every chapter. I think that was back to more sort of light-hearted territory, away from the kind of pretty dense political stuff that crept into Long and Winding Road.
Yes, that was more thematic than.
Yeah.
I think it's good. Now, Georgina's asked a very good question. Do some of your contemporaries from politics inspire your fictional characters?
None have so far, no. I'm trying to forget about politics in a sense. I mean, I work with some wonderful people, but I'm trying to sort of put that aside. And certainly, I mean, I managed to, more by mistake, in One of Our Ministers is Missing, to call the minister who's the villain after a guy that actually exists. So he was Lord. Jesus, I'm trying to think of his name now, because it was one book ago.
But he was there was a real lord with that name.
Yeah, a real lord with that name. Bellingham. So let's do that again. So I managed in One of Our Ministers is Missing to create a character called Lord Bellingham, who actually exists, and he's Henry Bellingham, who was my opposite number as a shadow minister when I was a junior minister at DTI. And I hope he's not taken offence at it, because he's a pretty awful character. Edward Bellingham is my character, not Henry, but he is Lord Bellingham. And the thing about Henry, incidentally, is he does have a criminal association, because he is the great-great-great-grandson of the Bellingham who actually assassinated Spencer Perceval. Spencer Perceval was the only prime minister in this country who's ever been assassinated, and he was shot walking into the House of Commons in 1811 or something like that. And the guy who shot him was Henry Bellingham's great-great-great-grandfather. So probably that might have been at the back of my mind. I've made him a criminal again.
Yes, you never know how your subconscious is working, but it trips you up. But you maybe in the future some of our contemporary politics.
We'll see. Yeah, it depends if they upset me or not.
Glennis asks, I remember reading in your autobiography that you were against the PO delivering junk mail, or Royal Mail, I suppose. How do you see the situation now? Are you anti-junk mail?
No, I was never anti-junk mail. I think I was describing how other people were looking at it. You know, our members felt that that this was a bit beneath them to deliver the stuff, leaflets.
Right.
Well, usually people were walking around the streets, kids were delivering or whatever, that we should deliver them. But I was arguing as a union rep, look, you've got to take work from where it comes. I used to say to them, look, can you imagine a shipbuilder saying, we don't want to build those ships? This is mail being delivered. This is pieces of paper being delivered through people's doors. So no, I'm on her side.
Right. And now it's forms an even bigger part of the mail.
Yeah, because the internet and stuff, but parcels is a big stuff. Ever since the internet started, the most common message was send me something through the post. So catalogs, magazines, books in particular, have to go through the post. And Royal Mail, really, that is a fertile territory for them. But, well, don't get me started on Royal Mail or the post office.
I thought that might
Yeah.
push a few buttons. Now, Wally asks, I've always understood that a new unknown author, to get their first book published is nigh on impossible, even more difficult for men over a certain age. Was the fact that you were a known face the secret? This may have been...
Oh, yeah, charmed life, yeah. I've seen lots of writers who are brilliant writers who struggle to get a publisher. I had publishers coming to me. So if I hadn't been a politician, probably people wouldn't have been interested in the memoirs. Once I wrote the memoirs, it gave me a route into fiction, although a different publisher. I mean, Penguin Random House, who published my memoirs, weren't too interested in my fiction, but my agent said, go away and write it, and then we'll have a bit of an auction. I see who's interested. So, but I wouldn't have had a chance of doing that if I hadn't have been a politician and if I hadn't have had success with the memoirs. So I recognise how lucky I am in that respect.
But you're not the sort of person who would have hired a ghostwriter and...
Well, I don't think many do. I mean, there's a few knocking around now. There's a lot of rumours about books by famous people, memoirs that weren't written by them at all. But you have to put somewhere in there, you understand this better than me, who the kind of ghostwriter was. It's hidden away in a text somewhere. And I don't know of many politicians who have done that. Certainly not Tony Blair, The Journey. He wrote that himself, and you can tell he wrote that himself. Ken Clarke, he sort of dictated it onto a dictaphone and someone else typed it up for him. So it was his work. So no, I wouldn't have dreamt of doing that. No, the whole fun of it was to write it yourself.
And it's true, I suppose, it's harder for older men to get published, but in that case, even if it was partly because you were well known, you're flying the flag for the first time older novelist.
There you go. That's my role in life now. Yeah, it's easier when you're coming in off the back of another genre. I mean, I'm actually writing a biography of Harold Wilson now for Compact. Wow. This is Swift Publishing, who want to do a concise book, because if you want to read a biography of a prime minister, you've got to pick up 1,500 pages on average, probably. And people just haven't got the time. They want a kind of digest, if you like. So Swift are going to do a series of them, 30,000 words. I'm doing Wilson. I think Ian Dale's doing Margaret Thatcher. Someone else is doing Winston Churchill. And so I'll be in the memoir section, the fiction section, and the biography section. Yeah, and that's great.
Get your own bookshop.
Yeah. Oh, good luck.
Well, as well as that, are you doing more Louise or something else?
My publisher told me at the launch event that they want to talk about the next one. I've got a few ideas actually that are not Mangum related, but because I want to do it a different timescale, and I'm stuck with Louise, it's very nice to be stuck with her, but she was born in 1970. So if I want to write something set in the 40s, for instance, it can't be Louise. But we'll have a discussion about that. Whatever happens, I'll be writing books. 2 minutes left.
So here's an enormous question that you won't be able to answer in 2 minutes. But Vicky asks, do you think politics has changed for the better or worse since your time in Westminster? So you left the Commons in 2017.
Well, leaving aside who's in government and the travails they've been through, I think it's got worse. And I think it's got worse because of social media. So I was probably the last of the members of Parliament who didn't have to have an Instagram account or didn't have to be on X or Twitter, who didn't have to be on Facebook. You know, I was nothing to do with any of that, and never wanted to be, and never will be. MPs now are expected as part of their job to be accessible in that way, 24/7, and it's usually to be accessible by people who want to sling abuse at them. Particularly difficult for women, really difficult for women in politics, because there's such a cesspit out there, as everyone knows who's been anywhere near social media. And if you've got a responsibility and you're, you know, elected to any kind of responsible position, you'll get all this coming in, and it can be debilitating, I think, for members of parliament who've got lots of other things to be doing. So I think that's made it worse. It's cheapened it and made it more.
Do you think that would have put you off becoming an MP if it had been like that?
I don't think it would have put me off, but you know, I came in my mid-40s from the trade union movement, where things can get pretty interesting and tough. Anyway, but I think people from other backgrounds maybe could find it a bit difficult.
And the last question, we've had your proudest moment in politics. Philip asks, what was your proudest moment supporting QPR?
1967 League Cup final against West Bromwich Albion. 2-0 down at half-time, came back 1-3-2.
Alan Johnson, thank you so much for talking to us about Death on the Thames and many other things. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us out there. And just a reminder, if you keep an eye on the Telegraph Extra website for more subscriber exclusive offers, events and competitions, you'll see a few things coming up, including our next Telegraph Book Club event, which is with the great historian Saul David on the 1st of May. But for now, thank you very much. Good night.